And first of all, Jeff DeBoer, I'm the CEO of the Real Estate Roundtable. Thank you for doing this, sir. I think the basic answer to your question, why hasn't Congress done anything? There's so many competing interests here, and I think we should step back and what is the problem? If there's an affordability problem, it's probably a supply problem. So it's also a cost problem. It's also a worker problem. And so all of those things taken together add up to lower supply. I think the data would show that following the great financial crisis, a dramatic drop-off in construction, both single-family and multifamily, has occurred. So how do we correct that, and how does Congress correct that? And this is the beginning of it, I think, sir, getting people from all parts of Congress to talk about this. As I said, it's a supply problem. How do you get more supply? You need more capital into that. The low-income housing tax credit was one way to do it. There may be other ways. You have a bill to encourage the conversion of obsolete buildings into housing. That would increase supply. But keep in mind, we need people to build. And there's a shortage of labor workers now. Maybe the Judiciary Committee needs to be involved. There are programs to bring in highly skilled workers. There are programs to bring in seasonal workers. Maybe we need a program to bring in construction workers to help construct programs. Maybe the EB-5 program is a role here. I don't know, but perhaps. And so I think there's a variety of things here that need to be addressed. Sometimes banks and lenders have not been encouraged to lend on development projects. We need to address that and see what the root problems there are. But there's a variety of problems, and I think the main thing is to get all the stakeholders in the room. You know, historically there was a environmental crisis in the 70s. All committees in Congress got together on it. There was an infrastructure crisis. I'm not saying all problems have been solved, but infrastructure was dealt with in a greater sharing of views way. And housing is another one. Certainly, we agree that housing is, you know, one of the most important facets of American life. It's the most important facet of all lives, and shelter. And I think the other thing is just recognizing that while over time we all wanted to own homes, I think that there has to be a recognition that as, you know, we move forward and amenities and people are changing in what they want. Not everyone wants to be a homeowner. People want to be renters now. And so we have to accommodate all of those facets. And then the final thing on capital, I would say, is a recognition that because of the long, prolonged period of artificially low interest rates, that people were able to get mortgages at sub 3% loans. Now, as rates have risen, and maybe there will be a cut later this month, but it's not going to go back to those levels, those existing homeowners who might have moved on in the process are sort of locked into their existing homes. And so they're locked in, not freeing up those homes, and it goes up and down the chain. So I guess I would say it's a holistic problem, not just a low-income problem, which we all know about, but it's a holistic problem up and down the scale. But thank you for doing this, and look forward to working with you further on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Now, Will Fisher.
Thanks. So Will Fisher, Director of Housing Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And Congressman, thanks so much for pulling this together. It's the summit together. It's so important to be lifting up this issue. So I think this question of how to break the logjam is a really important one and challenging one, and it's hard for the reasons that the other panelists have talked about. And one thing I noticed is that in some ways, the logjam has started to break in this current Congress. We've seen the big expansion of the low-income housing tax credit that was passed earlier this year. The Senate Banking Committee unanimously passed the Road to Housing bill. But these are bills that focus particularly on one aspect of the housing crisis, which is supply, and that is important. We face a very large housing shortage, and we need more housing, but it's also just one aspect of that crisis. There's 7 million people in this country with incomes below the poverty line who pay more than half of their income for housing, and these are the folks who are most at risk of problems like homelessness and eviction. Most of those people, this is low-wage workers, this is seniors and people with disabilities with low fixed incomes. And most of those folks don't have enough income to even afford break-even rents set to cover the cost of operating rental housing. So we need more LIHTC housing, we need more market rate housing, but no matter how much we increase the supply, that alone is not going to be enough to reduce rents to levels that those folks can afford. To do that and to really take on problems like eviction and homelessness, we're going to need more rental assistance. And that's going to require a major investment of federal resources. And we haven't seen a willingness to do that since some large investments that were made as part of the, on a temporary basis as part of the Pandemic Relief Act. And what we're seeing right now in the current Congress is threats to actually cut rental assistance sharply. So this would move in the opposite direction. So we need to do more to increase supply, but we also need to recognize that this is a holistic problem that needs holistic solutions.
Thanks, Will. First, I kind of want to touch upon something that I guess Will and Jeff and Emily kind of mentioned. One, coming here, I've been in Congress now for 8 years. I was in the fights of during Build Back Better. And what I've noticed is that, as was mentioned, there's often competing priorities of how and what gets prioritized, what will be funded. And it's a big pot. So when I was involved with Build Back Better, there was childcare, there was housing, there was just different components, and every part was a knockdown, drag-out fight. And one of the things I noticed is that afterwards we passed it, there was a component of the low-income housing tax credit in that bill, and it was, I think it was going to create 800,000 units over 10 years, so 80,000 units a year. And at first I was like, yes. And then I realized, well, that's too small, right? And then when it finally got to the Senate, a lot of that stuff fell out. So part of it is raising housing, these programs, to a level where they don't end up on the cutting room floor. And that is a big, big part of it. So when on the next, I'm going to ask some different questions, some prepared questions, but I want to think about how do you do that, or is it the housing crisis now so expansive that it's having more and more members talk about it? Will that be enough, or would it take something else? Emily, can you give us a little talk about the low-income housing tax credit? How many units do you see this new improvement creating? And then basically, how were you able to create this durable bipartisan coalition of members, but also stakeholders?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and also for bringing up Build Back Better, where I know there was a huge proposed housing investment on the table that many of us have been trying to figure out, how can we still pick up some pieces from that and get them across the finish line. So we were successful this year with getting some major pieces across the finish line on the low-income housing tax credit. There were 2 pieces included in the bill that passed a couple months ago that would finance 1.2 million affordable homes over the next 10 years, which is the biggest investment in affordable housing in many years, maybe ever. And it's still difficult to wrap my head around how big that is, and yet, some of the statistics we shared at the beginning, at least 5 million unit shortage. We've seen estimates of 12 million unit shortage. So it's a huge step, but that doesn't mean we can say, okay, we're done here with housing and now we can move on to the next issue of the day. It's just, we finally, broke through the logjam once, and I think part of that was because we had a piece of legislation, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, that has been around for 10 years, and each Congress, we've built more and more co-sponsors, we've expanded the tent. What started as kind of a core of some of the diehard housing folks on Ways and Means expanded to members of leadership in both parties, ended up having the full delegation sign on, House delegation from Tennessee signed on, places that, from Kansas, places that weren't necessarily the Californians and New Yorkers who originally brought the problem to us and said, we've got to do this. So I think part of what has made the effort so successful on the low-income housing tax credit, sadly, is that the policy crisis has spread to states where it wasn't before. Now we've got members representing rural Kansas and rural South Dakota who see the need to make major investments in housing, whereas it wasn't as relevant to them before. Politically, though, that does build support, where we've got Chairman Crapo on the Finance Committee has been talking about housing quite a bit in leading up to the bill and after. So I think part of it is, the crisis is past the point where anyone can kick the can anymore. And so after many years and many attempts to get pieces of it across the finish line, this ended up being the opportunity where the logjam did break. And I hope that now there's more, because I think there is a recognition, A, of the problem, but B, we have this program that's been around for almost 40 years. You don't have to stand up a new program at Treasury and spend 3 years writing regs to figure out how to get these credits out the door. Every state agency, and the California agency in particular, is sitting on 3 times as many low-income housing tax credit applications every year as it can award, and obviously the need is there. So just being able to say, yeah, you can get that pipeline moving is one of the beauty of expanding and strengthening the low-income housing tax credit. So it's also been, I think, Jeff talked about supply. I think we have a real product to show with the low-income housing tax credit too. There's a lot of misperceptions about what affordable housing is, and people recognize they don't want homelessness in their communities, but the thought of housing people who are coming off the streets or even low income is not something a lot of people want, in their backyard, so to speak. So I think showing that when you build affordable housing, it really adds to a neighborhood, it adds to a community. These are the types of properties that you do want, and it's also good for the people who live in it. I think has been a really important part of our success in addressing the misperceptions of affordable housing.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because my district is unique, and I'm trying to think, is that it has so many of the different types of neighborhoods. So we have single-family homes, we have high-rises, we have a large homelessness population. We also have first-time homebuyers, immigrants. So I'm always thinking about all the different components of, and that for me, it's a political necessity, but also recognizing that each one of them faces their challenges. But other members have more, I would say, homogeneous types of communities, more just suburbs, single-family homes, just dense urban area, just rural farmland. So or more rural communities instead of suburban. So it makes me think about how this has spread enough across the country that people are starting to recognize this. It's a problem across the board. Jeff, you talked about supply. How do you make sure that it's more supply is built in the right places and it's for the right market segments?
Wow. Well, first of all, you've done a great job on the low-income housing tax credit. It should be a model for all legislation of bipartisanship to get things done. It's great. And Will talked about, and I did mention supply, but even with added supply, there are going to be part of our society that can't afford that. And the rental assistance program that we have, the old Section 8, as it used to be called, program, it's capped. Maybe the volume should be increased there and expanded and made more available. The other thing on that program, on the rental assistance program, is just the way that it functions and the regulatory burdens and the timing of getting the rental assistance back into the owner's hands so that they can continue to provide the housing. And maybe it's a bad example, I don't know, but an analogy with food stamps, where grocers get reimbursed quickly on food stamps. Renter assistance, there's a time lag. And maybe that could be smoothed out. That would help this affordability problem. How do you build in areas that are acutely, have an acute problem? Well, those areas probably have more heavy zoning, more heavy permitting hurdles, more difficult or voices from the so-called NIMBYism crowd. And I don't know how you smooth all of those out, except to say that I think that if you allow capital to flow more freely, and have it get returns more quickly as opposed to a long lag in their development time or holding period, I think that capital will flow where there is a need. Right now, there's probably not a need for additional housing in, say, Austin, Texas, or Dallas, and there is a need in LA or New York. So that money would flow there, that capital would flow there if that permitting and if that those zoning and if some of the other rules that we see were eased up, because capital wants to invest, builders want to build, developers want to develop, but they're not getting the returns, they don't have the workers, the costs are too high. It's really not all that difficult to understand. It's difficult to untie that problem, but it's not difficult to spot what the problem is. I don't think you can direct we've got to build more housing in these parts of the country and ignore the other parts of the country. I think the market will determine where the market can best allocate its resources, frankly, sir.
Will, can you talk about how many people Jeff mentioned vouchers. Can you talk about how many people qualify for housing voucher assistance compared to how many people actually receive vouchers, and how long people are waiting to get a voucher?
Sure. So it's about 23 million households in this country that are eligible for and in need of rental assistance like a voucher. And only about 5 million of those households receive a voucher or some other similar assistance like public housing or project-based rental assistance. So it's less than 1 in 4 folks in need get rental assistance. And this is a source of many of the housing problems that we see in this country. Folks, there are long waiting lists for assistance. So on average, a person who gets a voucher has been on the waiting list for 2.5 years. And that really understates the problem. In many places, the lists are much longer than that. And that's only people who get assistance. And there are lots who aren't even able to get on waiting lists or never reach the top. But even 2.5 years is a long time to wait when you think that these are folks who in many cases are living in substandard or overcrowded housing or sometimes don't have homes at all.
It's interesting because one of the things that I always dealt with when I got here was people coming in always asking about the, asking for more vouchers. What percentage of our overall federal spending is on the housing voucher program?
So the housing voucher program alone in the last completed year, so that's 2024, was less than 0.5% of federal spending. When you add in the other rental assistance programs, it gets higher, but it's still under 1%. So it's a very small percent, especially when you consider that how important housing is to families' budgets and to their well-being.
And how much would it take to fully fund the federal voucher program for the 23 million eligible families?
So it's tricky to estimate because with any program like this, you don't know how many people are going to take it up, but it's in the range of $80 to $90 billion in addition to what we're spending there. That it would cost to do that, which would still bring us to less than 2% of the federal budget, so way less than what we spend on many other things.
It's interesting because I know the voucher program is a big part of the potential solution, but oftentimes it's not well supported across the political spectrum. How would you make the arguments to somebody who's more conservative that this is part of the puzzle to actually deal with this crisis?
Well, I mean, I think that the rental assistance is an essential piece to making so many parts of our economy and society work. So it's crucial to families and to holding families together and helping families with kids for folks who are concerned about that issue. It's crucial to enabling workers to make ends meet for folks who are more focused on that. It plays a critical role in the housing sector for landlords to be able to cover their operating costs. So I think it's an issue that is important for the people who are affected, but it also has just ramifications that reach through so many pieces of our society. And it's also important for smart investment for budgetary reasons. I mean, rental assistance has positive effects on outcomes like health and education, and so it's in areas that we're spending lots of money, and I think that's another benefit of expanding rental assistance.
If I could just, in the tax bill, there's a big argument about, okay, if you provide a tax cut, does that generate economic growth? And I think in the housing area, if it shouldn't just be looked at, what are we spending on housing? What are we getting in return? In terms of additional employment, in terms of additional tax revenues, in terms of all kinds of things that come back to the economy that I think, in response to your question about how would you argue this to a more conservative member, it's not simply, spending money. You're getting a return here that's not just a society return, but a return economically that sometimes isn't talked about.
Well, that's a great point, because Ways and Means always has retreats, and we always listen to economists, and one of the economists a few years came in and talked about how the cost of housing, how much people pay per month in rent and mortgage, plus childcare, are a drag on our GDP growth itself, which for me, it blew my mind, because I never thought that it was so bad that our country's annual GDP growth is being stymied. And it makes sense when you think about it, when you take into account average families place 30% of their income towards housing and then 26% of their income towards childcare, that there's not enough money left over to invest and to spur the economy. Maybe we can team you up and you can go and talk to some folks.
Has some numbers that show that the decline in the construction of housing since the great financial crisis they've assigned a number of basis points to GDP growth. It is reasonably significant that we can get to you. But.
And I think, sorry, I was just going to add that I think part of it is also, it's not just the money that they're not putting into the economy. It's also one reason we've gotten a lot of supporters for affordable housing from places we hadn't before is they're getting factories and plants moving in, and there's literally nowhere for people to live. So I think it's both, money that's not being spent, but also if there's no housing near jobs, you can get the plant you've been, advocating for in your district, but if no one can work at it, or they're driving in, 3 hours away, it's going to slow economic growth in that way as well.
There is, so we have the low-income housing tax credit. We have different ideas. We have vouchers. And I'm opening it up. Hopefully you guys don't shoot it down too bad. What do you all think about targeted federal investments through credits for first-time home buyers and building starter homes in my American Homeownership Opportunity Act? Can that help shift the market in the right direction to build more homes that are affordable so that more people from different income levels can become homeowners?
Don't you like a simple answer, yes? How about that? Yes, of course it can. But there's also the workforce that also needs help getting affordable and available housing. And so I don't want that to be lost on this conversation. I think it's up and down the spectrum. And I mentioned, by the way, the people who are tied into their homes with low interest mortgages. Now, this will really be controversial, but why not say it? Why couldn't you have a program where that existing homeowner might be able to take their low interest mortgage with them? And so if they're now an empty nester and they normally would move out of that home, opening up for people in a different part of the income spectrum to take that, but they're tied in now. But if they could take that low interest mortgage and apply it to a new home that more suits their needs, that would open it up. But right now they can't. And it's just one more barrier that locks up the housing marketplace. But your obviously your low income tax credit would be helpful to that market segment, no question.
Yeah, certainly all of the above, from first-time home buyers down to the Congressman's legislation to make the low-income housing tax credit more effective for extremely low-income tenants. So starting, from homeless veterans coming off the street all the way to first-time home buyers, there's just so much work to be done. So appreciate the question.
I think you mentioned something that kind of, it's interesting because I think you mentioned people need to live where they work instead of driving those 3 hours. We've also tried to tackle that problem by doing more public transit, which has also hit a lot of snags. I mean, don't look at California's high-speed rail, but there are examples that we can follow. And then if we are successful in bringing back some manufacturing, housing is going to have to be built in some form or fashion near the facilities that will help produce new products here in the States. One of the things that I want to kind of also tackle is how do you leverage the tax code in a number in ways to provide relief for homeowners? And what are your thoughts? And this is for Will. And what are your thoughts on a tax credit for rent-burdened renters?
Well, I mean, so one thing I'd say is just that we already have quite a bit of tax side costs that go towards helping homeowners. I think the issue with those is that they tend to be skewed much towards the higher end of the income spectrum rather than to folks with lower incomes who really need the help to afford home ownership. On the renter side, so you have our sponsor of the Rent Relief Act, which proposes a renter's credit, and I think this is something that takes on the single biggest housing challenge of just trying to make sure that people have the means to afford housing. And the tax credit is one way to get at that, and I think you can also do it through expanding spending side. I think we focus more on expanding spending side rental assistance with reforms to address some of the issues that Jeff was talking about earlier to make that work better for families and owners and folks who are administering it. But I think the key thing is that we recognize that we push towards guaranteeing for everyone assistance that will give them the means to afford housing, and that we put either federal mandatory spending or tax side resources behind doing that. And this Rent Relief Act is one way of getting at that, and I think you all deserve a lot of credit for proposing it.
No, thank you. One of the, I guess, how would you, and this is for all of you, it's just kind of off the cuff, how would you structure your policy or your arguments to reinforce the others' work? I know that's not your job, but I'm kind of curious, okay, you have the Low Income Housing Tax Coalition, you have the Real Estate Roundtable, you have renters. Is there anything that could tie them together? I'm just spitballing here. I'm not
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it's all part of getting at the same problem of housing affordability, and it really is essential to tie the issues that we've been talking about together, that you can't solve the problem just with supply. You can't solve the problem just with rental assistance, or a number of other aspects of this don't just work on their own. Addressing home ownership on its own isn't going to do it. We need a comprehensive policy that does get at all of these things.
And I would just add, I think part of the issue is even when you look at congressional committees, the program that creates the most affordable housing supply is run out of Ways and Means, whereas a lot of people would think of, the Housing Subcommittee on Financial Services and the Banking Committee, or the Appropriations Committee. They all have these different pieces, and then you think about the federal government, everyone would assume, well, HUD is the housing agency, but Treasury administers the biggest affordable housing program, and then there's all these other agencies, FHFA and the banking regulators that all impact the system. So I think part of it is even just deciding we're going to have a national housing agenda and bring all the agencies together, bring these committees together to address the different pieces. Because even though I advocate for the low-income housing tax credit, I think we know that if we need 12 million units, they're not all going to be for renters at or below 60% of area median income or below. It's the first-time home buyers, it's the formerly homeless. It's not just one program that's going to fill the gap. And so it's all of our groups working together. It's you and your colleagues working together, and also bringing in the different agencies that oversee different pieces that also have an impact on things like zoning, which isn't a resource issue, but is a huge barrier to affordable housing in the country too.
Talk about spitballing. Here's one. Every bill that is done up here, or regulation, there ought to be some Uber group that it goes through that determines whether it will encourage or discourage the supply of housing, that it will encourage or discourage capital going into housing. And I don't know what that Uber group is or how you form it, but it just seems that there should be some oversight that puts it all together. It's what the banking committee is doing. Are they helping housing or not helping housing? And somebody ought to be able to make that determination. Same on the tax bill, same on, as I mentioned, judiciary in terms of workers. And I would suggest that. I don't know how you do it. An interagency task force with the administration, I think, would make sense, and they do it on some issues. We saw it in the wetlands debate back 25, 30 years ago, where you had to go to various agencies in order to develop wetlands. And by the time you got around through all the agencies, the first agency had changed their rules, and so you had to do it again. And the government created an interagency task force on wetlands development, which set a firm definition and a firm rule there, and maybe there could be some model to be thought about there for housing.
No, thank you, and I appreciate that, because one of the things we're going to have to do is figure that path forward. Congress is structured in a way that is meant to keep things from happening quickly, and we have to get beyond that. So I know it's time for question and answers. We want to let the audience ask some question of the panelists. So just check. We'll go here, and then we'll go here first. Okay, go for it. Very polite audience
Just gotta keep it
members.
moving. Hi, everybody. My name is Steve Boyle. I'm the executive director of YIMBY Democrats for America. So naturally, very excited that you are doing this. It's very cool to hear you talk about, housing, affordability, supply overall, and also affordability when it comes to folks in low-income situations who need more direct help. But I did think it was interesting, and I say this out of love, not as a critique, that we talked about affordability when it came to low-income folks as not a question of supply. And I think about everyone who's in the endless lines and queues and lotteries for public housing, and it makes me think, we mocked Soviet bread lines. I don't think we're off the hook because our queues are virtual. I wonder, we talk a lot about, helping the market build more housing, and Congressman Laura Friedman just submitted the Cut Red Tape for Housing Act to make it easier and faster for public housing to be built. I'm curious, to what degree does Congress have a shovel to start helping this problem and leading to this American housing boom as well as the private sector?
I can say something
jump
about
on
that. I think that is part of the a way forward here is to build more public or socially owned housing. I think you could do that, and also permanently affordable housing. I think there are ways that some folks have looked at using LIHTC through state qualified allocation plans in ways that encourage things like that, like permanent affordability or a public role or resident participation. So I think that's important, and you could also look at providing other kinds of direct funding that would do that. And I think there's that kind of public or social housing could meet a lot of needs and be more responsive to the needs of residents and better insulate them from rent increases. That all said, it's also not the whole answer. I think you could have social housing and the issue or public housing and the issue that I talked about before of so many people just not even be able to afford the cost of operating that housing would still be there. So you would still need rental assistance like we have with the current public housing program, but it's done through these operating subsidies that are underfunded. But you would still need rental assistance to make it affordable to folks with the lowest income. So I think this is another thing that's potentially a piece of the answer, but it's not the whole answer.
I don't think government-owned housing has much of a role here. I think that we tried that in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and it became an isolationist policy. Low-income people were kind of treated as non-citizens and walled off, and I think that the basic approach of mixed use, mixed incomes in the rental housing area is a much more sustainable way to go forward, frankly, and to encourage that kind of thing rather than government-owned or socially owned programs that are all for low-income people. I just don't find that appealing.
Yeah, I
myself.
also think it's one thing to build government-owned housing, and it's another to keep it funded over the decades that you would like people living there. So, I think what we've seen is the public housing capital needs backlog has just grown exponentially. I know you're going to hear from the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities later today, and they've been working on, what would it really take to save even the public housing we have, much less any future public housing that, we could contemplate building. And it's, going to need over $50 billion of private capital just to shore up what we have. So, low-income housing tax credit, a part of what we know is going to be done with the expansion here is helping not just to build new housing, but shore up some of the existing housing. But with Congress, going through, well, we'll see if there's a government funding bill in the next month, but with these fits and starts and kind of steady decline of the public housing fund, it's just tough to envision that being sustainable, whereas with something like the low-income housing tax credit, you've got the private sector on the hook to make sure the property is affordable for at least 30 years or they don't get the tax credit. So there's more of a guaranteed life of the property that you can assure with some of these other models.
Yeah, and by the way, just a footnote to what I said, I don't want to be misunderstood. I think there is a big role for the government in this and a public-private partnership to help create this housing. I just don't think it should be all government. I think private capital, private investment, the animalistic instincts to succeed in business are what needs to be released in this area in a partnership way.
Yeah, and just to add on that, when I was in the California legislature back, 2000, this was before 2016, this was 2014, we did a back of the envelope kind of math on how do we fill the backlog of housing units, and it would have cost $250 billion. So it would have been at least 12, California has a big budget, but not that big to build it. And then at the same time, this is when I say too slow, too small, and too expensive. Some of the units that were getting built, even with money from the public sector as part of those, were costing $700,000, $800,000 a unit. Too much. The public is going to recoil at that, as we've seen. So it's kind of like, how do you kind of speed it up, big enough investment, and then at the same time not as expensive per unit? I think over here.
Thank you.
I think.
Can you hear me okay? Good morning. Thank you, Congressman, for doing this. CEO of Prime for Development, Arturo Snyder. We've been developing in urban communities across the U.S. for nearly 40 years. Following up a little bit on what Mr. DeBoer mentioned, that there's a possibility here to explore how commercial properties and basically the repurposing of buildings in the commercial space have such an impact on the fabric of community, where there's a massive properties that are underutilized. So the zoning issue, of course, is an issue, but also perhaps there's an opportunity for federal involvement in adaptive reuse policies and approaches for densification. We've done master planning on very large-scale projects across the United States, and it is usually exactly what was mentioned earlier, that is, when you have the mixed income and the mixed use in the community, that we see a lot of opportunity. So perhaps is there an opportunity for, from a federal perspective, to look at adaptive reuse, oversight, zoning, perhaps funding for repurposing of commercial properties, particularly in these areas where you have, as was mentioned earlier, the need for housing near the possibility to build manufacturing, and not have to do it in suburban markets where then the infrastructure and the transportation gridlock becomes a big issue. And thank you for hosting this.
This gentleman has a bill that would do just that, and a bipartisan bill with Congressman Kerry from Columbus that would kind of build off the low income or the historic rehab tax credit concept that would provide a tax benefit for people that own these obsolete buildings. And there are a lot of office buildings. That's the main topic, office building conversions. Obviously, you know this, but also other buildings that are obsolete. And they can either be demolished and replaced with new buildings. But keep in mind, that's quite expensive, and it also has its negative impacts on the environment when you demolish a building. You could convert a lot of buildings, and a lot of conversions have been going on, a tremendous amount, actually. But, and those are the low-hanging fruit, a lot of low-hanging fruit. Now we're getting into the area, sir, where buildings that are more difficult to convert, that need a deeper subsidy, because communities are providing, whether it's tax abatements or other forms of incentives to convert, you know, you need that other additional incentive, and the federal government could provide that to, you know, to overcome the problems with existing buildings, floor plates, or the HVAC systems that need to be revamped from a building only into a residential unit only type of HVAC system, or all kinds of issues that are very, very costly that, again, a lot of low-hanging fruit. A lot of conversions have been done, and a number of members of Congress will say to me, why would you want anything more, because there are conversions going on? Well, the answer is that the tough ones are the ones that are left now and that could be, you know, incentivized. So I would encourage the congressman to move forward as he has and get others involved in this, because it could be. And by the way, it's not just beneficial to housing. It's beneficial to cities where these vacant properties are declining in value. They're declining in property tax payments to governments, which provide some assistance to renters or what have you. And so if you put those properties back into a more productive use, you get a double or a triple bang benefit from that, and you know that well, sir.
Yeah, no, it's, I fought to carry this bill when I was originally on Ways and Means in the majority, and then I got kicked off, and you know, I've been in this game long enough. I knew some people will try to take it, so I ended up resubmitting it, even though I wasn't going to be in the majority. I was actually kicked off the committee, and shortly after I got back on, Mike Carey is like, we struck a deal. When you're in the majority, you carry the bill, and I'll be your second. And then when I'm in if we get back in the majority, I'll be the lead, and you'll be the second. And the reason why is because it's like, it's not about credit, it's about getting it done as quickly as possible. And what I loved about the idea is when I was an undergrad at UCLA, I studied downtown LA. And a lot of the things, as you know, Arturo, was the adapted reuse ordinance passed, trying to convert a lot of those old office buildings that were underutilized or just completely abandoned. So it could have a transformative effect on communities by bringing more housing, but people, right? The cities die when there's no people on the streets. So I'm a big believer in this bill for that reason. Convert, bring people, that brings money, that brings a multiplier effect to that neighborhood. So thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you. Tom Amder, Lincoln Avenue Communities. We're one of the largest affordable housing developers in the country. One, I guess, theme that you guys didn't talk about that I'd love to have you explore a little bit more is the role of operating costs. So when I go out and develop LIHTC properties around the country, we're able to leverage more private sector finance when our operating costs are lower and be less reliant on subsidy. And one of the fastest growing, Emily knows where I'm going, one of the fastest growing parts of our operating budget is insurance, and I know this is a big issue in California, in your district in particular, sir. I'm curious how you all look at that intersection between housing affordability, insurance, and operating costs in general, and where it fits in this equation.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, Tom, as the leader of the AHTCC's insurance working group. Yeah, it's a huge issue, and you know, whether it's insurance or other costs that rise, of which there have been many in the last few years, the thing about affordable housing is it's designed that you can't pass the costs on to the tenants, whereas with market rate developments, you know, you can see those rental increases year after year and pass it on to the residents. So, you know, insurance is such a tough one to address because it's both, you know, a market that's not regulated at the national level in the way a lot of things are, and it's also, you know, the impacts of climate change are, things that are way beyond the control of housing, but it is creating astronomical costs to underwrite, whether it's because of climate or even, some insurers who are discriminatory about insuring properties that have low-income residents. So it's a major problem. There have been some promising steps in financial services and banking committee to try to look at what we can do. Much like the housing crisis itself, I don't think there's a silver bullet, but it's definitely something that I think should be considered as part of how we make sure the affordable housing portfolio is sustainable and that we can build more affordable housing with the resources we have without having to pour as much into these skyrocketing insurance premiums.
So before we wrap up, one last question. If Congress were to invest into housing and across programs, what type of investment, what's the back of the envelope number you would give me if I was I don't want to say king because we can't say that nowadays, but if I had the power just to do it, how much would you say this is what we need?
Well, I'm not going to answer that question directly, but we do have a recent kind of a number that gives us scale, which is the investment in the low-income housing tax credit that just passed. The changes in the bill cost about $16 billion and are estimated to finance 1.22 million more affordable homes. So I don't think it's linear and how you spread that out among all the different programs it would take to tackle the crisis, but talking about the vouchers and what a small part of the federal budget it is, if even for $16 billion you can get over 1 million units, and let's say we wanted to create 5, I mean, the amount you're talking about is it's not insignificant, but in the scheme of the federal budget is certainly doable if Congress decided it, had the bipartisan will to tackle it.
That is a political answer if I heard one, but it's good. Jeff?
I don't have any idea, but I think your bill is not all that pricey in terms of conversions. I mean, I think it was scored in a relatively low number. I mean, and I think what Emily has said is right. The rental assistance is a small part of the budget. So whatever it is, it probably is a lot of money, but on a relative basis to everything else that the government spends on, probably not that high, given how important this is. I do think the question or comment on operating costs is very, very important to understand that yes, insurance costs have gone up, but so have general operating costs, electricity, maintenance, security. Everything that goes into owning and operating a building goes up and continues to go up. And so I think, that needs to be recognized in this debate, that sometimes rents go up, but they're going up because other costs are going up and the cost of operating buildings are going up. And sometimes we get distracted on other debates about how to control costs or control expenses, which get us off the topic, I think. So I don't know how much it costs, but there are a lot of smart people around here that can figure that out. And if this is in fact a crisis and it is in fact an essential part of life, providing shelter for people, we ought to be able to do it.
Great.
Yeah, and I would say it's certainly to really solve the problem, hundreds of billions of dollars over a 10-year period. There's a lot the federal government can do to address this problem without actually spending money at all. Things like addressing regulatory barriers to building more housing. Also, I think on the regulatory side, strengthening some kinds of tenant protections against things like arbitrary fees or evictions without cause. But that for a big core of the problem, for expanding rental assistance, for other things that are targeted on helping lower income folks afford housing, like addressing the public housing capital backlog that Emily mentioned, building more permanent supportive housing. Like these are needs that aren't going to happen without a federal investment. But this, for all the reasons we've talked about, it's well worth the money. This would be a smart investment for us to make.
Well, thank you. With that, gentlemen, Will Fisher, Jeff DeBoer, Emily Cott, let's give them a round of applause.